he was once more hustled off to the Bastille, but after a 2-week stay was offered the alternative of going into exile, and he opted for England. Voltaire's stay in England from May of 1726 to November of 1728 profoundly transformed and enriched his intellectual and aesthetic outlook, as the Letters philosophiques, 1734, amply testifies. He vividly and most sympathetically evokes life in 18th century England, primarily in order to contrast it favorably with French laws, customs, traditions, science, philosophy, and even literature. He likes life in England. He thinks it's great, and he says, boy, England's great, it's got this, in France we've got that. He compares so much, their laws, customs, traditions, science, philosophy, and literature. Skip a bit. Also featured are such powerful political institutions as the English Parliament, with its House of Commons, English empiricist philosophy and science, as embodied by Francis Bacon, John Locke, and Isaac Newton, and English tragedy and comedy, with the focus on William Shakespeare as a new kind of genius. So Voltaire apparently saw Shakespeare. And he saw Shakespeare as being, quote, untrammeled by classical rules and conventions. From a sharp-tongued wit, a gifted poet, and a dramatist, Voltaire had made himself over into a philosophe, P-H-E at the end, who soon would become the undisputed leader of the Enlightenment movement. Now that right there should make you be interested in his life. He's the undisputed leader of the Enlightenment movement. Now, in parentheses, the book on England that he wrote was promptly condemned and publicly burned in France, and its author had to seek refuge near the eastern border. He went to the province of Champagne at Caire, where he settled in the chateau of Madame du Châtelet, a remarkable woman who was a brilliant intellectual and a scientist in her own right. Voltaire lived in Caire, C-I-R-E-Y, for 15 happy years, and productive years from 1734 to 49, when the premature death of Madame du Châtelet left him disconsolate and at long last open to the repeated offers of hospitality of Frederick the Great of Prussia, a long-time admirer and correspondent of the philosophy, Mr. Voltaire, who had been urging him to become his permanent guest at his court at Potsdam. Frederick the Great of Russia wants him to come be his philosopher at court. Now, in Will Durant's The Story of Philosophy, he says that after there's a bit of a tussle between the two, we'll get to in a second here, he says of Voltaire, one squeezes the juice from the orange and throws away the rind. And that's what he figures he's going to do with Voltaire. You know, use him to become more educated and then throw him in prison or something like that. Now, while he was at Caire, Voltaire deepened his knowledge of Newtonian mathematics and physics, which in 1738 would result in the elements of Newton's philosophy. So, if you want to know a bit about Newton and you want Voltaire to be your guide, see if you can find a PDF of that online. We skip just a bit. In his poem Le Mondain, the worldly one, published in 1736, he sharply ridiculed the myth of primitive happiness and innocence during the so-called Golden Age, as embodied in the biblical story of Adam and Eve. Conversely, he extolled the Epicurean delights of comfort and luxury brought about by modern civilization. In the mid-1700s, the comforts of modern civilization? In spite of his controversial reputation, he garnered such high official honors as being elected to the French Academy in 1746. We skip a little ways. And as a deist, he generally also subscribed to Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz's theory that God would not create a universe other than the best of all possible universes, as expounded in his Theodicy, 1710. Now, that doesn't mean that God did create the best of all possible universes, does it? But Voltaire and Leibniz are together in saying that if God were to create a universe, or a world, he would create the best of all possible ones. He wouldn't create anything less than the most perfect possible. They agree on that. It's just that I don't think Voltaire thinks that God actually went through with it. There is no God. He couldn't go through with it. And that's why we don't live in the best of all possible worlds. Voltaire's stay at the court of Frederick II from 1750 to 53 turned out to be an unmitigated disaster. Frederick was basically an autocrat, in spite of his much publicized image as an enlightened philosopher king. Plato. Voltaire's irrepressible wit and bold irreverence were bound to displease and eventually anger his royal host, and eventually Voltaire had to leave Prussia hurriedly and under humiliating circumstances. I think he actually had to dress as a woman and was in a stagecoach that got him across the border. He settled down in Geneva in December of 1759. Now, there's a little bit that it doesn't mention here about Voltaire. I think whilst he was with Frederick II, whilst he was there in the, supposedly trying to educate him, the guy, Voltaire bought some lottery tickets or something, some lottery, whatever they do. Well, I don't think they had tickets back then, but there was a government lottery of a certain sort, and Voltaire was forbidden from investing. He was forbidden from purchasing. And the government did it in a stupid way, and it was just a sort of a form of robbery of the citizens, probably. But Voltaire saw through the scheme. I don't know the details, but Voltaire, forbidden from purchasing these things, purchased a bunch of them anyway, and made a massive amount of money off the government's stupidity. And that made Frederick quite angry. That's from Will Durant's Story of Philosophy. So he settled in Geneva, and he got a property in a nearby place called Ferney, and this would be his retreat for the next 19 years, until shortly before his death in Paris in 1778. Voltaire's early optimism underwent a profound change under the impact of events in his personal life, as well as in reaction to those natural and man-made catastrophes that made him keenly aware of human suffering and misery. So early on he was very optimistic, but then there was one tragedy after another in his own life, and not only that, but all of the sickness and disease and catastrophes and so on that he's heard about and seen in the world at large. His optimism changes. His intense and immediate empathy. I cut off the beginning of that sentence. So he had intense and immediate empathy. He spontaneously identified with all victims of calamities, war, injustice, prejudice, and intolerance. For example, the news of the terrible Lisbon earthquake on November 1st, 1755, which claimed tens of thousands of lives, overwhelmed him with dreadful images of women and children buried under the rubble, and inspired his eloquently anguished poem Sur la désastre de Lisbonne, right? The poem on the disaster of Lisbon, published in 1756, in which he clearly signals his rejection of Leibniz's concept of a rational and well-regulated universe. The protracted and devastating 7 Years' War, 1756 to 63, also deeply affected Voltaire's outlook on the human condition. Now, Voltaire believed in the hierarchy of literary genres and the, quote, neoclassical canon, the belief that there were certain forms of literature that were more important, more enduring, and more prestigious than others. Novels, short stories, and tales were looked upon suspiciously as upstart genres with no credible aesthetic or even a moral pedigree. So, Voltaire didn't think that this book we're reading here, which is Candide, he did not think that it would be an enduring or important work. He thought that he would be much more well known for his essays and his more scholarly works, but such has not been the case. One of Voltaire's early philosophical tales, Zadig, was subtitled Destiny, which appeared in 1747. It is set in the kind of whimsically imaginary and exotic Oriental setting dear to 18th century authors. Should we wait for these guys? Oriental setting dear to 18th century authors, from Montesquieu to Diderot. Diderot, right? Diderot. The uncannily wise, resourceful, and resilient Zadig, whose name derives from the